This is lecture 4, where we're going to talk about nature culture, which is a sort of pair that have been a long subject of interest and theorizing in cultural anthropology, and which I think is the main theme that animates the things you're reading in this unit. So we're going to start from that, and I'm going to sort of navigate you through what I think are some of the most important things that have come out from the readings in this particular unit. So, the debate or the sort of theoretical interest in the divide between nature culture and questioning whether that's a divide at all or how nature and culture are related to one another. In this unit, we're going to look at that both in how individual bodies are understood, represented, etc., and also social bodies, moving from sort of individuals to units like families, for example. And one of the other components I think that's really important for this unit is thinking about how particular kinds of powerful institutions or bodies of knowledge or practitioners are really influential in terms of how we view that nature-culture relationship or divide, particularly science, medicine, and the law. So this is both about how we experience that nature-culture relationship in our own bodies, in our own families, in our own social networks, and also how all of those experiences are informed by these sort of broader institutions and social forces that are around us. So as I said, nature versus culture is a long-standing subject of theorizing in anthropology. It's also a question that's been sort of critiqued, or the theory that's emerged about nature and culture has been critiqued, and you read some of that in the things that you read for this unit. One of the ways that I think about it is, we're looking for what are the cultural models of the relationship between nature and culture, and how do they vary from place to place. And one of the things I think to keep in mind is those models are not always logical, right? In other words, there are sort of internally contradictory assumptions built into those models, right? Including the ones put forward by what we think of as sort of rational, objective, neutral entities like science, right? So what we're trying to understand here is really the cultural logics or illogics, right, that underlie both the sort of accepted cultural expectation and again, how that is reified and sort of reinforced by entities like science, medicine, and the law. So I'm thinking here of these entities that I'm sort of calling institutionalized and expertized fields as being in a sort of feedback loop with cultural models. So they often fall back on what I'm calling these cultural logics or cultural illogics. So again, part of the question here, which is a holdover from what we talked about in last unit, is that even entities that would describe themselves as being beyond culture, as being rooted in some other, again, more objective way of processing information, like medicine, are still ultimately sort of informed by cultural patterns, cultural models, and the illogics that they bear forward. Okay, so that's sort of the main starting point for everything we're going to look at in this unit. Okay, so before we really jump into the main issues for this unit, I did want to connect a few dots, both from what we've been looking at before this unit and a couple of sort of broader comments about the nature of the scholarship on this and other issues in the course. So the first point is that I hope you have noticed the way in which this unit's material is in part, what it's doing is extending the history of medicine that we started looking at in the last unit. So looking at the more recent and contemporary points on that timeline that you started reading about last time. The other thing I want to point out is how interdisciplinary really the scholarship on these issues is. Even just in this unit, you're reading stuff from practitioners coming from a few different fields. So Fausto Sterling, for example, is a biologist and historian of science. Grayson is an American Studies scholar. And Martin, Gutman, Ramberg, and Blackwood are all anthropologists, right? But the fact is that anthropology is in conversation with other fields in the social sciences and humanities, and that's and the sciences too, to some extent. I mean, Fausto Sterling, the work we're reading is not exactly biological research; it's more history of biology. But again, it's a very sort of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary field of inquiry. And I did want to just point out again. I think you're probably noticing this, but that idea that this is a broad conversation among scholars, which is not unique to this subject, right? This is more of a point about academic scholarship in general, is, you keep seeing the same names coming up. And I think it underlines that idea that academic scholarship is really a conversation, right? So, for example, we see Grayson is citing Martin, right, who you read for this unit. Ramberg is citing Kulik, who we read in last unit. Martin cites Lacour, who we read in the last unit. Gutman cites Fausto Sterling, who I've mentioned before and we're reading in this unit. And then everybody seems to cite Butler. And in fact, I sort of thought when I do this course the next time, I'll probably add a reading from Butler. But I did also add then some links to some scholarship by and about Butler, Judith Butler, in D2L. So you don't need to read that, but if those of you who are interested in tracing out some of these networks of scholars might be interested in her work. And then Butler cites Foucault, who we read last unit as well, right? So again, there's a sort of genealogy, but it's not even just a straight line, right? There's some scholars and pieces of scholarship that become touchstones, right? The Foucault history of sexuality gets cited a lot, right? And Butler's Gender Trouble, which everybody's citing in this unit, right? That is a real touchstone. So in that sense, there's sort of this starting point, but a lot of the rest of the scholarship really is going in multiple directions, right? So it's not just a linear process, but there is that sense of influence and back and forth across the work of these different scholars, okay? The final thing I want to point out, again, in the interest of contextualizing all of what we're doing here, is, which I think was particularly pronounced in this unit, but is something that runs throughout the whole course, is self-critique within anthropology. One of the things that I appreciate about anthropology as an anthropologist is that anthropologists have, for the duration of the discipline, been very willing to engage in an auto-critique, meaning a critique of their own field, right? Not only taking to task specific scholars' findings or arguments, but critiquing major premises of the discipline and sort of towering figures, right? So there's a lot of continual questioning and redefining of even some of the main theoretical approaches, right? So nothing is sacred, I guess, is my point within anthropology, which I think is a good thing. And you certainly see some of that in this unit, where people are saying, this scholar whose work has underlined a huge area of thinking in the field, was not only wrong, but maybe problematic, and we should redo that. So that's another thing just to keep in mind as something about anthropology and about just academic work more generally. Okay, so in this unit, I want to highlight 4 themes that I think run across the readings that you did. They are the naturalizing of the sexed body, which both Fausto Sterling and Gutman speak to, the quote-unquote pathological nature of the female body that Martin really sketches out for us, racialized female bodies, both individual and social, and both Grayson and Blackwood, and then Ramberg to a certain extent as well, all speak to that. And then gender, sexuality, and relatedness in families, right? With a built-in questioning of what family even means. And on the part of Ramberg, rethinking of family as something like social networks of caring, right? So Grayson, Blackwood, and Ramberg all speak to that theme. So I'm going to talk about our readings sort of through the lens of these four major themes. Okay, naturalizing the sexed body. This is our first theme. And the overarching idea here is that we're looking at the ways that science and medicine are complicit in constructing sexed and gendered bodies. We get two examples of that. Fausto Sterling's work on intersex births, where she's really talking about how a sort of arbitrary binary has been projected on and enforced on what is actually a continuum, right? And then Gutman is focusing on testosterone as a substance often understood to be the root or the essence of manliness, right? So those are both sort of areas or mechanisms by which bodies are both sexed and gendered. So that's what we're going to look at. Okay, so let's start with Fausto Sterling. This is an excerpt from her book called Sexing the Body that was published in 2000. And I want to talk about it, what she said in this publication in 2000, and also sort of connect it to some more recent stuff. So we can see how some of the things that she talks about have played out. So her focus here is on intersex births, right? Which, as she and others estimate, is a little less than 2% of all births, right? So, so a not uncommon phenomenon, right? And she's giving us really sort of the 20th century history of how medical practitioners respond to these intersex births when they occur, right? And she points out that really since the 1960s, again, she's writing from the perspective of the year 2000, so about 25 years ago, but that the consensus was to surgically intervene at the time of an intersex birth. That it was considered basically a medical emergency, that it had to be treated immediately, and that the assumption was that what doctors were doing was uncovering the true sex of the child. So again, the sort of cultural model that underlies this approach is that there are two and only two sexes, and what you're trying to do is figure out which this particular child, quote unquote, really is, right? So in other words, the relative frequency of intersex births did not, or really has not, because I'll show you that it's still not a sort of settled matter in medicine today, encourage a rethinking of the assumption that there are two only sexes, right? I mean, clearly nature is handing us something way more complex, something that's more of a continuum. So, historically, intersex births did not encourage that rethinking or that recognition of the social constructedness of the binary model. Instead, what it encouraged, again, this is Fausto Sterling telling us this, is a policing of the bodies that fall into these borderlands between male and female. So inserting a clear divide through medical interventions, again, in what is, if we modeled it, would be much more like a continuum, where there are folks that fall in the middle between male and female, right? So these medical responses are making a hard and fast line and saying you must be on one side or the other of this divide, and we're going to do things to make your body fit into one or the other category, right? So what Fausto Sterling is getting at here is that is a somewhat arbitrary decision to make at the time of intersex birth. It's based not on biology, it's based on social ideas about masculinity and femininity and about men and women. And to emphasize how both arbitrary and specific that asserting of that divide is, Fausta Sterling reproduces this diagram called the phallometer, right? She had her sort of own version of it, but the one in the corner here is the one originally produced by an organization called the Intersex Society of North America, which I'll talk about briefly in a minute, which shows the actual physical measurements that have been used to make a decision about the quote-unquote real sex into which an intersex, a child born intersex, will be placed, right? So it's literally measuring the size of the genitals of an infant for the sake of figuring out whether it should be classified as a boy or a girl. And if it falls into that sort of intermediate phase, then surgery to push the child's body to one side or the other of this ruler is what happens, right? So this is Fausta Sterling demonstrating for us that there's a sort of cultural logic or illogic informing these practices. It's not rooted in biology or in some scientific fact. So, the sort of overarching points that Fausta Sterling are making are that the nature of the sort of pathologizing of intersex people or of intersex bodies is really about those bodies not fitting into culturally constructed categories and presumed biological categories. So there's cultural work that needs to be done, and in this case it's also medical intervention to make folks fit into two and only two categories. As Fausta Sterling points out, there's a bunch of different binaries that get sort of crammed into this kind of decision making. It's both about what she calls a culturally intelligible sex and gender, and it's also about sexuality, right? As she points out, fixing, quote unquote, fixing intersex people is not just about making them male or female, it's also about making them heterosexual. So there's a sort of heteronormativity as well as a rigid understanding of sex and bodies smuggled in or built into this system. So this idea of culturally intelligible bodies, I think, is a really useful tool. So the lens through which normal or abnormal is being assessed is one of cultural intelligibility. Do bodies fit with our presumed cultural categories about what the world is like? And if they don't, then again, the intervention is employed to make sure that they do. Now, as I said, Fausta Sterling wrote this this was published in 2000. There has been some change since then, and quite a bit of it is because of increased activism by intersex people who have been successful to a certain extent. Again, I'll show you sort of the mixed results in changing the ideas and procedures around intersex infants, and also the language used to talk about intersex people. So I want to talk a little bit about what has happened or who the players are. And interestingly, there's a relationship between Fausta Sterling and some of the things she's published and intersex activism. So, in the previous slide, I showed you that phallometer, and it was created by the Intersex Society of North America. That was an activist group of intersex people that was in place from 1993 to 2008. And it was sort of one of the main centers for activism around intersex issues in the United States during that period. It closed or ended its work in 2008 and sort of handed the baton off to this organization, which exists now, which is called Interact Advocates for Intersex Youth. This is an organization specifically focusing on young people, or being sort of put forward by young people, but that carries a lot of the same goals of the ISNA. Now, as I said, interestingly, Fausta Sterling's work is an influence, or one of the parts of the conversation that pushed forward intersex activism. So in a previous lecture, I think it was in lecture 2, I mentioned Fausta Sterling publishing this this article called The Five Sexes, right? Where she said there's definitely more than two, and she comes up with this model of five, right? That was in 1993. And indeed, and it was published in a journal called The Sciences. It was also published in the New York Times, so it was fairly widely sort of circulated. A couple of months after the publication of The Sciences, the journal received a letter to the editor from Cheryl Chase. And Cheryl says a few things in the letter. First is that she found this very interesting, this article called The Five Sexes, and that as an intersex person, she has, a particular sort of understanding or insights to bring to that conversation. She also, so she starts by sort of lauding Fausto Sterling and sort of being thankful that she's bringing these issues to light. She also does take a moment to critique Fausto Sterling, who, as you probably noticed also in the piece I had you read for this unit, uses some really now outdated language like hermaphrodite, right, which is really no longer part of the sort of lexicon to talk about intersex people. So Chase says in the letter, thank you for doing this, Fausto Sterling, but I've got to take issue with your use of words like hermaphrodite, which, as she says, are a heritage of Victorian medicine and without prognosticative value, right? Which is certainly accurate. And those terms are no longer used in medical and other contexts. And the other thing that Chase does in this letter is say, and we're starting a support and activist group called the ISNA, and she even says, contact us in this letter. So this advent of this group is partly about Fausto Sterling making this issue more visible and more public and sort of opening debate about it. Again, the baton was taken up by Interact after that. And, as I said, I think the results of this activism and advances in sort of medical understanding has made changes, but it's not complete. So, I was looking for sort of the most updated account of the current state of medical thinking on what is done in the case or in the context of an intersex birth. And I came across this. So this is the American Medical Association's Journal of Ethics, and this is a piece from 2021. And it is, as you see, a call to update standard of care for children with differences in sex development. So first we can see yet another shift in the language. So intersex, at least in the medical context, has mostly been replaced by this phrase, and it's often shortened as DSD, right? Differences in sex development. So there's already a sort of a more neutral way of talking about that particular set of circumstances. So what they're saying in this article is there's still a lot of debate among medical practitioners about policy and standards of care when there is a DSD birth, right? They point out that a lot of organizations have already banned or mandated against surgeries that are simply cosmetic or are not being done to correct something that would have caused physical harm to a child, right? So a number of organizations have done it. And the AMA is saying, or this particular set of authors within the AMA is saying, we need to follow suit, right? There needs to be a clear statement that this is not acceptable, right? But what they lay out is that has not happened, right? And that there's still quite a bit of mixed opinion among physicians about what to do. So, for example, they note that one study about the relationships or the back and forth between parents and physicians in the context of an intersex birth, they found that the discussion of surgery to quote-unquote normalize the child's anatomy prevails over discussion of the controversies that surround early surgery and the child's autonomy, right? So some of the critiques are those, again, that Fausto Sterling raised. It's largely, or many of these surgeries are unnecessary in terms of health conditions. And there's a question of the child not being mature enough to participate in that decision making. The decision is made for them by their parents, right? So, again, this article lands on this idea that, or this assessment that despite lots of organizations, primary organizations in the field of health, working against that or mandating against that, that there's still a battle, right? In other words, an ongoing debate about whether the medical community should continue to engage in those sort of elective surgeries. And the ongoing argument from those who support continuing with those elective surgeries is, as is noted here, in favor of early surgical intervention is the argument that a child with ambiguous genitalia could face psychosocial distress because of this difference, right? So, in other words, sort of the more things change, the more they stay the same. So, definitely movement in this area, more visibility, more sort of willingness to examine this as a complex issue, but still a certain amount of sticking with what's always been done around the actual medical procedures that are used. Okay, the other example we have in this question of sexing the body is Gutman's piece on testosterone. So this account of the place of testosterone in sort of the public imagination and as a medical treatment is a much more recent history. Gutman points out that we've really seen a rise in the use of testosterone as a sort of treatment for something called low T is really from the early 2000s, so, the last 20 plus years. And, as he points out, this is really sort of a contrived condition in men. So it's one of those things where the treatment or the cure created the disease, which is something in medical anthropology that we refer to as medicalization, where a normal bodily process or a normal bodily variation is medicalized. In other words, it's turned into a pathology that needs to be treated. So the advent of things like this testosterone replacement therapy ad that I've put on the right of the screen here, and the products that really exploded at that time and have continued to be in circulation till today, he says is really about a long-standing interest in identifying the essence of maleness or manliness as it exists or is assumed to exist in the male body. So it's sort of trying to figure out where that key to manliness is, right? And it wasn't just testosterone, in the history of sort of the medical history of this. As he points out, there's been a long search for the root or the essence of manhood in hormones, in chromosomes, even as he notes in sort of fairly odd finger measuring. And, again, it's kind of the situation where the social concern with these issues creates some of the categories around it. So, for example, he notes that testosterone didn't exist before 1905. Of course, it did exist, but this is very similar to what Blank in our last unit said about heterosexuality not existing before the 1860s, right? In the sense that as an object of inquiry or as a category that people turn to, it was not part of common parlance. So, the fact is there's very little evidence to connect testosterone to quote-unquote manliness, and especially or specifically to connect it to aggression or violence, which is one of those themes that comes out in the study of testosterone, right? Gutman suggests that a lot of what emerges around that assumption that there's some kind of connection between testosterone and maleness, and particularly male aggression, is an example of confirmation bias, meaning assumptions people already have about men and about what men are like are then found in the studies that are done about it, right? So there's an assumption that then, of course, is more likely to be the outcome of those studies. So, again, there's not only no evidence that testosterone and aggression or violence or any of those other sort of qualities attributed to men sometimes, that there's no evidence that that connection is there. And more generally, it's really a misrepresentation to say that men in general are aggressive or men in general are violent, right? So in other words, it is the case that most murders are committed by men, but we need to put that in the context of the vast majority of men not being murderers and not being violent at all, right? So it's both, I think what he's critiquing here is both this generalized representation of men and the way that that representation has been reified or sort of concretized in these ideas about testosterone and the response with these testosterone treatments. So, again, if we look cross-culturally, if we look historically, we can see that the expectations for what a man is supposed to be like have changed and are variable. So this is yet another example of needing to understand the role of culture in constructing ideas and practices around bodies. So he makes a couple of recommendations given this history. The first is, not unlike what we'll see from Martin, that we need to put an end to some of the metaphors we use to describe men, because we're re-emphasizing this inaccurate set of assumptions, right? So he points out, the thing is called "Are Men Animals?" So he points out that referring to men using these metaphors of animals, right, pigs, snakes, dogs, etc., is problematic. That language matters, and we need to do away with those metaphors. And then the other thing he says, which I think is very useful for everything we're doing in this unit, is he encourages folks to adopt a stance of what he calls bioskepticism. To be clear, this does not mean rejecting biology or rejecting science or anything like that, but it is a stance of critical thinking about what we learn or hear from biology and the medical sciences, right? So, especially because, as he's demonstrating, some of those models are informed by culture, not science, right? So, so this is, I think, where he sort of lands, is not only with some more insights about this case of testosterone and how it's understood, but a broader call for us to be more bioskeptical. So I will suggest that we do that for this course as well. All right, so another author dealing with metaphor. So we're moving on to our second theme here, which is the quote-unquote pathological nature of the female body. This is written by Emily Martin, and this has been a really consequential book in feminist anthropology or anthropology of gender. It was published in 1987, right? So there's also a couple of things I want to sort of update in the conversation that she's engaging us in. But again, some of her findings are still really important. And even if some things have changed since this was published, the fundamental critique that she makes is still something we can be critical of, right? So what she's doing in here is calling out the metaphors that are used to describe certain processes in the female body, particularly menstruation and menopause, and suggesting that those metaphors, which are embedded not only in sort of popular discussions, but actually in medical textbooks that are used to train doctors, right, to train medical students, that those are sort of doing damage in the sense of really having an effect not only on how we generally think about menstruation and menopause, but also how we think about women. So she's trying to uncover or reveal those metaphors for what they are and challenge them and say, actually, right, they're also not accurately representing what's happening. So, or they're one way of representing something that happens to be negative and denigrating to women and women's bodies. So, when she looks into, again, particularly medical descriptions of these processes that are a natural part of women's bodies, she finds a lot of language that suggests both menstruation and menopause in language of decay, loss, failure, breakdown, right? She suggests that language only makes sense if you start from certain assumptions about the female body. Notably, that its main purpose is pregnancy and childbirth, right? Is biological reproduction. So, for example, a lot of the language around menstruation is about, a girl or woman having a period as being a loss or a failure, right? Or waste, in the sense that in that particular cycle, that girl or woman did not become pregnant, right? So that idea that the default for the woman's body is pursuing and achieving pregnancy, and the much more typical, having a period every month, is the loss, failure, waste, she says, is embedded in how medical discussions of menstruation are put forward, right? Likewise, menopause is described in terms of breakdown, failure, loss, decline, along a lot of the same expectations, right? That reaching the end of the possibility of pregnancy and childbirth is understood also as decline, the destruction of something, the loss of something, the move from the normal function of the female body to a pathological state, right? So the kind of metaphors that bring in all those ideas, she says they've changed over time, right? There's a sort of a bunch of different versions of them. But it was really starting in the 19th century and moving into the 20th century that we have these metaphors of things like the body as a business or the body as industrial production, right? Where the idea is that there's some primary goal that body is supposed to reach. And if it doesn't, then there's a sign of something broke down, something went wrong. Martin anticipates the critique that, well, that's just what's happening. So using that language is just an accurate representation of the waste, breakdown, whatever, in the female body. So to sort of ward off that critique, she notes that, in fact, lots of other bodily processes that are parallel in lots of ways to menstruation are not described in those negative terms, right? So, for example, sperm production, which is arguably much more wasteful than menstruation, is described in laudatory terms, right, as a sort of miraculous event. Likewise, other sort of less culturally elaborated bodily processes, like the fact that the stomach lining turns over, is described in terms of renewal, not deterioration or waste. So again, what she's saying is, it's not an accident, it's not incidental that these metaphors that are used in these descriptions have particularly negative reactions or descriptions of what's going on in women's bodies, right? That this is also about cultural ideas about women in society. I wanted to point out one other thing, because as I said, this book was published in 1987, so we might think, well, it's much better now, right? And, maybe in some ways it is, but I think some of these things are still part of the public imagination. So one of the things I thought was really, it was hard to forget this phrase, right? She quotes from a textbook by Guyton this sentence that menstruation is the uterus crying for lack of a baby, which, as she notes, is a pretty evocative phrase to be plopped in the middle of an otherwise understood to be objective medical textbook, right? So that Guyton textbook was actually in production from 1956 to 2011. So it had a very long run. And, one assumes that the uterus crying for lack of a baby was put in there in the earlier part of that history and was taken out. I couldn't find it in the most recent edition, but it did stop production in 2011. But I did find the last edition, which was published in 2011, and sure enough, the very first sentence, or first couple sentences in this chapter, right, about female physiology, is still exactly the same as what Martin found in 1987. And the way the textbook is organized also reflects that. Basically, there are two chapters in this textbook about female reproductive biology, and one is the physiology before pregnancy, and the second one is the physiology during pregnancy, right? So that first, again, little paragraph in the first chapter about women's reproductive biology in this book in 2011 read, and again, Martin was citing this exact passage in 1987, so clearly they never edited that out, is female reproductive functions can be divided into two major phases. One, preparation of the female body for conception and pregnancy, and two, the period of pregnancy itself. So, again, the assumption that the female body is for pregnancy and that anything that is not that is failure is still quite a part of the perspective of this medical textbook in 2011. Right. I found another example that I wanted to bring up. So, the language around menopause, right, she also notes as being, again, about decline, deterioration, failure, whatever, right? This is an article from 2023 in a peer-reviewed journal called Cell. And it's a sort of overview discussion of menopause and the current therapies for menopause. And just a quick glance through it, I found some of that same language, right? So it's about cessation, loss, irreversible loss, and later in the article, that menopause marks the threshold below which normal ovarian function cannot be maintained, right? So again, the idea that menopause or menstruation are sort of pathological states, although they are, of course, very normal parts of women's lives. So, what is Martin arguing in the end? The first is that we can clearly see the bias in these kinds of representations, right? It does not correlate with the actual women, right? The title of the book is The Woman in the Body, right? So what she's saying is that bodies are not just sort of biological machines, but there's a woman inhabiting that body. And a lot of the writing and representation does not seem to include that, right? Include the actual woman. So for example, she says, it really doesn't make sense to represent menstruation as a failure in the case of a woman who has done everything in her power to not get pregnant, right? Someone who doesn't want to have a child, right? Likewise, it doesn't make any sense, or it's not accurate to describe the natural transition to menopause, which is a part of every single human female on the planet, and is a natural part of the life cycle, to present that as a pathological state, right? So, her suggestion is that these negative portrayals, again, are not an accident, and they're not incidental. We shouldn't just be like, well, whatever, it's something written in a textbook. She's saying that they reflect and reinforce negative social attitudes about women and about women's bodies. So, in other words, these gendered assumptions about women and about women's bodies are being projected onto the models used in reproductive biology. So, like Gutmann, she's saying we need to call out these metaphors, right? And we need to insist that other kinds of language are used to describe these bodily processes that don't smuggle in all these sort of negative ideas about the person in the body. Okay. I wanted to end this little part with a little sidebar. This is an excerpt from a piece that was published in 1978. So this is an article written by Gloria Steinem, the sort of very famous feminist activist. And she originally appeared in Ms. Magazine, right, which was really important during that sort of mid-century period of feminist activism. And Steinem wrote a piece called If Men Could Menstruate. And I think it's apropos of what we're talking about in this unit, so I just wanted to include a little piece of it. I'll read it so you can hear what it says. So Steinem says, the characteristics of the powerful, whatever they may be, are thought to be better than the characteristics of the powerless, and logic has nothing to do with it. What would happen, for instance, if suddenly, magically, men could menstruate and women could not? The answer is clear. Menstruation would become an enviable, boast-worthy masculine event. Then she gives some examples of what that would look like. Men would brag about how long and how much. Boys would mark the onset of menses, that longed-for proof of manhood, with religious ritual and stag parties. Congress would fund a National Institute of Dysmenorrhea to help stamp out monthly discomforts. Sanitary supplies would be federally funded and free. And here she has some very dated references. So insert your popular celebrity here in place. So she says, of course, some men would still pay for the prestige of commercial brands, such as John Wayne tampons, Muhammad Ali's rope-a-dope pads, Joe Namath jock shields for those light bachelor days, and Robert Beretta Blake maxi pads. Military men, right-wing politicians, and religious fundamentalists would cite menstruation as proof that only men could serve in the army. You have to give blood to take blood. Occupy political office. Can women be aggressive without that steadfast cycle governed by the planet Mars? Be priests and ministers. How could a woman give her blood for our sins? Or, or rabbis. Without the monthly loss of impurities, women remain unclean. And finally, male intellectuals would offer the most moral and logical arguments. How could a woman master any discipline that demanded a sense of time, space, mathematics, or measurement, for instance, without that inbuilt gift for measuring the cycles of the moon and planets, and thus for measuring anything at all? So she's being funny here, but in fact, I think the fundamental point that there are some power dynamics around gender embedded in our perceptions and certainly in the way we talk about and represent the natural processes of women's bodies. Okay, so we're going to move on to our third theme now, which is about racialized female bodies, both individual and social bodies. And both Blackwood and Grayson speak to this issue, and really what their overall point is here is that ideas about race are entangled with ideas about gender, sexuality, and family, and therefore inform portrayals of both individual and social bodies. So it's about gender, sex and gender in the body. It's about sexuality, and it's certainly about other kinds of ways that people have been identified and categorized, including race. So let's start with Blackwood, who is, in this article, critiquing ideas about woman-headed households, right? And those are representations, particularly in the scholarship and elsewhere, though, as well, in sort of popular understandings. And what she's saying is, what she sees in those representations of matrifocal households is a focus on the missing man, right? And that is a figure she calls patriarchal man. So she's saying the way people are describing these households is saying, where's the man? And that is a root of a problem or a dysfunction or pathology for those families, those households, all right? So this is her critique, right? She starts with sort of a critique of the ways that anthropology and anthropological theory have been complicit in those ideas. This is really a critique of kinship theory, which is universalizing in many ways about marriage and family forms. Not that they're all the same, but that there's a kind of universal expectation of some of relationships that fit into certain types or certain categories, right? And as she suggests, right, as a critique, what is in there, right, even if it's not explicitly said, is that the baseline is a heteronormative family, right? So that modeling, that theorizing, almost automatically leads to non-heteronormative families being understood as outside the system or problematic in some way. She mentions in particular Levi-Strauss, and Levi-Strauss comes up in several of the readings in this unit. This is, one of the sort of from the earlier mid-century period in cultural anthropology, but a theorist who's, so in other words, some time ago, this is not cutting edge work, but it certainly has had a big impact in a lot of ways on theorizing. And one of the key things that Levi-Strauss argued is that basically marriage as a general institution derives from relationships between men, right? That it's really about men making alliances and men essentially trading property, meaning women, right? So in this model of Levi-Strauss, men are the agents, men are the actors, and women are the objects of circulation, so to speak, right? So in other words, built into Levi-Strauss's model is an assumption of this sort of original, primordial, heterosexual, dominant man, and that kinship derives from that figure, right? So super problematic, right? Like nobody would embrace that today, including cultural anthropologists. But part of Blackwood's point is that even if we would call that out, there are elements of that that are just embedded in the way we talk and write about families and households, and we really need to root them out. So, as she points out, feminist anthropologists have long critiqued that model and models like it, right? So challenging these sort of heteronormative assumptions about marriage, about families, etc. And feminist anthropologists have done so by highlighting families and households that don't meet that model, right? Like LGBTQ families, like cases of reproductive technology that sort of expand the notion of the relationships around reproduction and around family. And also looking at the cultural variability across different forms of marriage and family, right? One of the things that I think cultural anthropologists often do to challenge assumed categories is to look at the variability across different places in the world and say, well, it's certainly not just that, because over here people are doing it in a radically different way. So one of the kinds of families or households that can be used and has been part of a critique of those assumed heteronormative principles of family and marriage is matrifocal families, right? So that's exactly what Blackwood does in this article. She presents us with two examples of matrifocal families as a way to challenge those assumptions about the heteronormative family/household, all right? So the two examples are Afro-Caribbean households and the households of the Minangkabau, who are the people she worked with herself, right? So her fieldwork is in Sumatra, in Indonesia, with the Minangkabau, and that is one of the key examples she gives to tell us like what matrifocal households and families look like, and that there is a logic to them. They are not just functioning, at half speed because there's a missing man, right? So this is the overarching thing she's trying to accomplish here. All right. So, and what does she put forward then in terms of what's being said about these two kinds of matrifocal families? So she starts by talking a little bit about Afro-Caribbean families, right? Where she says the main way that those families have been discussed in the literature, right, is based on Western assumptions of a particular set of roles in a nuclear family, including the husband who is present and is provider, right? And so what she says is these families were considered to be dysfunctional in some way because they were lacking the man, right? That there was a missing man. On the contrary, she suggests, no, these are not families with a missing man, these are families organized in an alternative way where the man is marginal to the running of the household and the way the family is organized. And indeed, there is instead a woman or women at the head of that family, right? Then she turns to her own fieldwork, right? And she says that the studies of the group of people she worked with who are matrilineal misrepresent them in some of the exact same ways that these Afro-Caribbean families are represented, right? There's that same idea that either there's a missing man or that men are somehow not accepting of the way families are formed, and there's tension there, right? And she is going to tell us more so that we know that that's actually a misrepresentation, okay? All right, so I think the first thing I probably need to give you a little bit more of information or context for in order to understand really what she's talking about with this idea of these matrilineal families among the Minangkabau is understanding what descent means, right? This is like a thing that cultural anthropologists are really interested in. So descent is the idea that often in families, in extended families, there are certain patterns for how both belonging in a family and also things like the passage of property or wealth is organized, right? And there's multiple variations on that. But one set of variations is when there is what is usually called unilineal descent, where property and, again, sense of belonging in the family is passed along one line, meaning either from fathers to sons or from mothers to daughters, right? So the father to son route is called a patrilineal system, right? So both are unilineal, one line. So patrilineal is the sort of going down the male line, and matrilineal is going down the female line. I actually wanted to show you just really quickly, and then we'll come back to this slide, what I mean. And these little charts, again, anthropologists have long really liked them. I don't know if they're helpful or not, but it is a good visual way to sort of understand what we're talking about here. So these are kinship charts. And the way they work is the triangles are men, the circles are women. When you have a bracket like this where people are parallel, those are siblings. The equal signs are marriages, right? So you see then the process of descent from a previous generation to the current generation, right? So on the left here is the patrilineal, and on the right is the matrilineal. So what you can start to see on the patrilineal side, remember that's descent from father to son, is this line of blue triangles, right? And on the matrilineal side, there's this line of red circles, all right? Let me show you another example of just a matrilineal descent group that I think it makes it even clearer. So, usually the way these charts are done, and you may have even done one of these at some point where you have to like draw your family tree, it's the same thing. So ego is the starting point, right? That's like yourself or whoever's writing this chart. So again, if this is matrilineal, the blue is the matriline, right? The matrilineal group that ego is a part of. And the red is other matrilineal groups. So we're in a matrilineal society where people are organized into matrilineal groups, right? So ego is part of this particular blue matrilineal group, right? So what you see here is, again, descent goes from mother to daughter, from mother to children, really, but particularly from mother to daughter, right? What that means is husbands marry in from another matrilineal group, right? So here's the grandmother of ego, right? The husband marries in from the red group. So what that means is the matrilineal belonging and property passes down to this blue grandmother's kids, right? Particularly her two daughters. She has two daughters and a son, right? The son is going to marry out into this other matriline. So the daughters are going to stay in this same matriline with the mother, right? And then when they have children, again, their husbands are going to come in they're going to marry in from somewhere else. And their kids, right, stay in that line. So it's mother to daughter, right? So you start to see then, this is like an abstraction of the processes that we're learning about in Blackwood's article, right? So in a matrilineal society, like the one she's describing, the kin group and all the stuff that goes with the kin group, their house, their land, their money, like where the kids belong, all goes through that mother-daughter line, right? So what does that mean in practice, right? It means that women are the owners of the houses. They live in their own houses, that women own the land, that they produce their own heirs, right? Because remember, the kids belong, quote unquote, to the mother. They're part of the mother's line. And that also, because men marry in to the family, women have the right over men's labor. So in this society, men build the houses, but the houses belong to the women. The women, that again, part of that matriline, the women own those family homes, which are actually really also incredible houses. I put a couple of images up here on the right. If you're interested, you can look up Minangkabau on the internet. You can see lots of examples of these like really interesting spike roofed houses. That these are like their big family homes. So again, this sort of focus on the female line of descent means that the husbands who marry into that matrilineage are certainly they're important, right? The idea is not that they're somehow completely disregarded, but they are considered essentially permanent visitors in their wives' homes. They are marginal to the affairs of that matrilineage. Those men still maintain their ties to their own. They're part of another matrilineage. Remember, they married in from the red matrilineage, for example, right? So they're still members in that matrilineage. They belong to their mother's matrilineage. So again, back to the misrepresentation that Blackwood's trying to call out here. What she's saying is often the tendency has been to talk about this as a strange system and one in which men are sort of on the outs and they're mad about it. So they're either always trying to like run away, migrate away, or they're fighting to gain control or something like that. And what she says, having done long-term field work there, that's not the case at all, right? Men live within this system because this is the system of how descent and property are organized. It's a variation, right, on how families and households are organized. And indeed, in this particular system, it gives a challenge to that assumption that heteronormative families and households are somehow the default or the most natural, right? Like, so again, there's no missing man from the Afro-Caribbean families, and there's no disgruntled husband in the Minangkabau setting, right? Instead, these are matrifocal family and household forms, right? So she's calling this out as, again, a misrepresentation rooted in both ideas about gender, ideas about families, and ideas about race, like racialized representations of women, men, and families, right? So ultimately, where she lands is that these family forms that are headed by women of color in non-Western contexts are being pathologized because of all of those inaccurate assumptions about what a family is or should be and what the roles of women and men should be, when in fact it's much more complex than that. Right, talked about descent. Okay, so the other piece that speaks to this idea of racialized female bodies in this context of thinking about particularly families and relatedness is Grayson's article. Grayson's not an anthropologist, she's an American studies scholar, and she's focusing here on a particular legal case, which I think really speaks to a lot of these issues. This was a case in the 1990s And it has to do with both reproductive technologies, right? And the ways in which they have transformed in certain ways, or at least challenged how we think about relatedness, families, parents and children, all that stuff, right? They've made that much more complex. And they also speak to sort of questions about parental rights and relatedness and well-being of children in a case of a contested surrogacy arrangement, all right? So you read all about the specifics of the case. I'm not going to repeat them here, but basically it's a legal case between a gestational surrogate, which is Johnson, and the contracting couple, which is the Calverts, right? And Johnson decided during the pregnancy that she wanted to keep this child, and the Calverts took her to court to enforce the surrogacy contract that they had entered into. As you learned, Johnson lost this case, right? So a lot of what the Grayson's account is about is, again, the cultural logics or cultural illogics that were the sort of unspoken part of how this case was decided, both in the court and in public perception, right, and in the media. So what the court said is, and the reason that it found in favor of the Calverts was, first, the genetic link between the Calverts. Remember, this is a gestational surrogacy. What that means is the egg and sperm come from the Calverts, and Johnson is carrying the fetus to term, right? The first part, again, this is in the thinking or the ruling of the court, is the genetic connection. And the second that the court put forward is that the Calverts intended to become the parents, that it was their idea, basically, which I think we could all challenge just on its face, right? So plenty of children are not intentional, but we wouldn't challenge the parentage on those grounds. Just as importantly, Grayson points out the media representations and sort of public understanding of the case was often, again, based on all kinds of assumptions. And a lot of those assumptions were racialized understandings of relatedness. So, for example, when the Calverts said, and this was reproduced in the media, that the baby or the child now, quote unquote, he looks just like us, right? That was, again, sort of going to this question of whether people of different perceived racial identities can actually be related to each other, right? Likewise, there were, racist depictions of Johnson in general, right? All speaking to the idea that the child belonged with the Calverts and not with her. And we've seen that a lot around particularly African-American mothers in the United States over time. So those same kinds of narratives came out in this case, right? The fact of the matter is, though, that it's much more complex than what any of those arguments would put forward, right? The fact is that Johnson carried the child to term, right? So questions about what it means to be the mother or what it means to be the parent are clearly much more complex than what was put forward by the court or by the media. Reproductive technologies, or really different ways of conceiving and rearing children, of which there are now many, they divide up processes of reproduction in different ways than we might have understood them to be in the past, right? There's a larger number of people involved. So it questions what we mean by being related or being a relation with someone, right? Being a blood relation or an other kind of relation. And it also challenges what we understand a mother or a father or a parent or a family to be. So really what she's saying here is that the law hasn't caught up with that complexity. And the law still, as do many people, lay people, carries all those cultural biases, right? So it's both reifying certain ideas about bodies and about, again, nature versus culture, right? Do we understand this on genetic terms or in social terms or something else? And being aware of the ways in which all these sort of ideas about people, whether it's, by virtue of gender, sexuality, race, etc., end up informing what is put forward as a decision about really complex cases like this. I included just the little news story in a San Francisco newspaper about that decision, right? Noting when the case was decided in favor of the Calverts over Johnson. Okay. So the final sort of theme that I want to talk about is about the sort of ideas about family. So gender, sexuality, relatedness in families or as families, or thinking about them not as families per se, as Ramberg encourages us to sort of think of new ways of defining or voicing what a family is. Social networks of caring or relationships of caring, right? So Ramberg, I think, ties together a bunch of the things that all three of these articles are talking about. Ramberg talks about reconceptualizing relatedness in a couple of ways. The first is that we can think of it as, quote, a technology for self and world making, right? So not as something that just happens to us, but as a sort of activity that we engage in. And the second part is that relatedness or conceptions of relatedness are normalizing and disciplinary, right? So there's both a way that they can be reimagined in sort of new or creative approaches to what relatedness means, and there's a way in which they are limiting or that they will assert a normal form. So as I say, I think this Ramberg's assessment here, or discussion here, overlaps in all kinds of ways with the critiques coming from the Blackwood and Grayson articles. Some of those ways are questioning assumptions about quote-unquote blood relatedness, also thinking about or recognizing familial relationships as in part always being about property relations, and in some cases being outright commodified, right? As in the example of the Grayson article, right? Where there's a sense of really turning reproduction into a commercial transaction. Also that Ramberg points out, and again, I think this goes directly to some of the stuff in Blackwood and Grayson, that family relationships or relatedness are, we tend to think about them more as being about inclusion, but they're also just as much about exclusion, right? And again, back to the main theme of this unit, nature culture, that reimagining what relatedness means also means rethinking gendered personhood. So let's break that down a little bit more. These are sort of key themes that Ramberg uses in her piece, and I've indicated where I think other things we've read also fit in and overlap with these themes. So again, the overall point to Ramberg's article is to critique ideas about the universality of kinship and family, right? That we need to think about relatedness in those terms, and or that there are particular forms of kinship and family that are the default, the most natural, the universal, etc., right? Ramberg's bringing a queer perspective to these questions, right? And talking about both sort of how to make use of ideas of relatedness in new ways, and the important activity of denaturalizing a lot of the stuff that is, again, the sort of assumed basis of kinship and family, right? So calling out the ways in which these ideas about kinship and family also speak to all kinds of assumptions about sexuality, about race, and about the sort of economic and capitalist context of family. Family units are also economic units. Marriages are economic transactions in a lot of ways. That's not to say they're not also about all kinds of other things, but recognizing that when we analyze it, and if we want to shift the way relatedness is understood. So, again, extending the boundaries of kinship beyond the notion of blood relatedness. Ramberg points out that, again, as I just alluded to, property is always a part of kinship and family. That there are sometimes explicit exchanges of goods at the moment of a marriage, for example. There are others certainly built into things like, family, passage of property and wealth across generations of a family. So marriage, again, in a lot of ways, is about property as much as it's about love or bringing children into the world or whatever else. And as she also points out, that reference to the property relations part of marriage also connects to some really noxious elements of both U.S. and world history over time, including slavery and colonialism, right? Where, again, the things like marriage, childbirth, child rearing, etc., were collapsed into very exploitative sort of formal practices around who is recognized as an actual person, how people's labor is claimed or distributed, who children belong to, all these kinds of things, right? So again, there's a really sort of troubling set of associations running just under the surface of many taken for granted ideas about marriage, family, kinship. So her point is marriage and kinship are legitimizing. They give value both to relationships and to particular people, right? And there's that, inclusion exclusion part. In giving legitimacy and value to certain relationships and certain people within those relationships, it also excludes a lot of other persons and relationships, right? So particularly the positions of queer folks, of unmarried people, of folks in non-heteronormative family forms are positions outside of this system, right? So again, this is not unlike what we've read about models of the body, where certain kind of bodily functions are inside the idea of how things are supposed to work, and others are relegated to the outside. And when you're pushed to the outside, right, then there's a sense or there's a projection of not belonging, not being sort of part of normal social life, right? So she's suggesting all of those things are being produced by many of the things we say and do around ideas of kinship and family. That exclusion, Grayson cites someone in her work that talks about that exclusion actually in terms of social death, right? And uses this phrase, marriage death, right? Marriage/death, to underline that the creation of family forms in a normative way often or does really always assert some who don't fit in with that social scheme for relatedness. So it's when marriage is asserted as taking a particular form, and through that form legitimizing people and relationships, it, as a matter of course, delegitimizes other kinds of relationships and persons, right? In talking about this, Ramberg also puts forward a critique, really, of the way that same-sex marriage has often sort of played out or been pursued, right? Even in a country like the United States. What she suggests is normative same-sex marriage. That is, same-sex marriage that is pursued in the same form as heterosexual marriage, plays into some of these same problematic assumptions, right? This is the way she puts it. Again, talking about same-sex marriage being formulated in a sort of normative way. She says, socially marginalized people continue to reach for and implicate themselves in a form that reproduces hierarchies of race, gender, class, and caste, even, that's a typo, as it confers legitimacy, right? So, so she's really kind of saying we need to think about the entire system, not just how to claim our piece of it. And that is, again, a broader critique that we don't really have time to, pursue a lot. It's one piece of this article. but certainly an interesting take on that question of how to think about family in the sort of contemporary era. So Levi-Strauss again comes up, and I think this question of nature's cultures that Ramberg returns to as well also absolutely speaks to what Fausto Sterling and Martin say in their articles for this unit. So that, again, Levi-Strauss, all about the dyads or the pairs. And, again, one of those fundamental pairs is the nature-culture divide as mapping onto female versus male, right? Male is culture, female is nature. Back to that idea of marriage being about acting males circulating passive females, right? So again, a troubling theoretical model, and one that still, again, sort of sneaks into lots of thinking about family and marriage. So Ramberg then says that the goal that she is putting forward for herself and for others is to upend those assumed pairs, right? To challenge them, to blur their boundaries, precisely through looking at some of the kinds of things we've looked at in this unit, right? Things like reproductive technology, things like chosen families, right? Getting rid of the distinction between real, quote unquote, and fictive, quote unquote, kin. Another area that's burgeoning in cultural anthropology is thinking about multi-species relationships. So not even just reimagining relationships among humans, but recognizing that humans are not completely separated from the rest of the world, right? That we often are enmeshed in environments and engaged with animals and plants and all kinds of other beings. So a lot of what this, again, goes to is this idea of rethinking models of situated personhood, right? So in other words, I think all the things in this unit speak to some of those really fundamental categories with which we understand the world, whether it's through the lens of cultural anthropology or any other field, right? What is a person? What is relatedness between people? What is a female body? What is a male body? And I think all the thinkers, all the scholars in this unit have tried to unpack a lot of those assumptions and come up with alternative models, or at least encourage us to think critically about them. So we'll stop there, and I'll talk to you again soon.